It's been a good while since Star Fox has been in the news, and even longer since the franchise had a game release, and even longer since a well-received one. But Star Fox isn't dead, or at least, it doesn't have to be. Let's talk about it. Since the release of the Switch, the theme seemed to be to revitalize franchises by going back to the drawing board, seeing what's crucial to the heart of that game series, and building the best game it could be. Or at least that's what it seemed like was going to happen, since that was the case with Breath of the Wild and Mario Odyssey, but didn't turn out to be as ubiquitous as we saw with more by-the-book releases in Kirby Star Allies and Yoshi's Crafted World. But whether it happened everywhere or not, this is the opportunity I've been hoping just about every Nintendo franchise would be given. And with the amount of silence around Star Fox, I'd hope this is one that's benefiting from that methodology. So today, we're going to take a look at what's crucial to Star Fox and what can be added or detracted to make the perfect Switch game that would revitalize the franchise. And let's give it a title so we have something to refer to. Let's call this game Star Fox Galaxy. Every other one has a one-word suffix, so we'll stick with that for simplicity. First, the elephant in the room. Should Star Fox Galaxy be a faithful modernization of the classic on-rails shooter and sometimes dogfighting spacecraft gameplay of the original and several subsequent titles? Well, in the defense of this position, this was the framework for Star Fox, Star Fox 64, and Star Fox Command, and these are some of the better reviewed games in the series. But, and I hope you all know I was going to land on this position, no. That absolutely shouldn't be the core gameplay for Galaxy. And I'll use Star Fox Zero and Star Fox 2 not as the reasons, but as evidence for my logic. I think that genre, like many others from the 8 and 16-bit era, was a necessity to give you as broad a scope as could be offered by the limitations of current technology. Similar to other tropes like random encounters in tall grass in Pokemon, controllers only allowed a certain amount of movement, and the console only allowed a certain scope of gameplay, so on-rails shooters it is. And it's certainly worth celebrating the innovation of the time, but when something is pushing technology and creativity at its inception, like Star Fox was with the FX chip, it likely should continue doing it down the road. So if we look at Star Fox Zero, this is basically exactly that faithful modernization of on-rail shooters, but with an unfortunate gimmicky controller setup. And on the whole, it was liked okay, but rarely loved. And if you think the reason it reviewed poorly was due exclusively to the controller setup, I've got a game called Kid Icarus Uprising to remind you of. Anytime that game comes up, the narrative is great game, awful controls, which is certainly different than that of Star Fox Zero. And then Star Fox 2 actually goes further to cement this point. This game was basically completed to release on the SNES, but then canned at the last minute to release Star Fox 64 instead. But then in 2017, they included it on the SNES Classic for the world to enjoy for the first time. And although it reviewed as would have certainly been a good game back in 1995 or whatever, I think it served to solidify that this format is either dated or at least arcadey, and would be hard to make a new game in this style worth more than $20 as an eShop game were it not for brand recognition. I'm sure I could go into more detail on that part of my opinion, but we've got to get to the meat and potatoes here. So do me a favor and go ahead and comment down below whether you think an on-rails shooter could go over well as a full-price game on the Switch. And while you're down there, if you're not subscribed, go ahead and do so. We make 2 videos like this a week, and we'd love for you to get to watch them. So if Star Fox Galaxy is not an on-rails shooter, what is it? Well, there have been a couple other official Star Fox games, and one that kinda counts. These are Star Fox Adventure, formerly Dinosaur Planet, Star Fox Assault, and the much more recent StarLink Battle for Atlas that included Star Fox and Friends on the Nintendo Switch. And as many have said, that team may be much closer to having created a great Star Fox game than we'd like to admit. So what are the core tenets that make a game Star Fox? I think exploring various planets, shooting down enemy ships, banter with your teammates, but nowadays, I think there's another huge element that can't be overlooked. There are many characters whose cultural iconization has been solidified not just by their mainline games, but also by their inclusion in the little-known series Super Smash Bros. And I think that portion of their personality needs to be reflected in their games. If you play as Kirby in Smash, and then you play a Kirby game, you'll see that they generally feel pretty similar. But other characters such as Star Fox, Captain Falcon, Ice Climbers, and a bunch of others, these characters' in-game representations don't really match what we're used to seeing in their respective franchises. Fox McCloud does get out of the R-Wing in 2 of the Star Fox games, though most of Star Fox Adventure is on foot and some of Assault is. But in any case, I think that these days, that's a crucial part of the Star Fox personality that needs to be adequately explored and represented. So Star Fox Galaxy should start with the foundation of StarLink Battle for Atlas. The Lylat system is made up of multiple planets that can be traveled between, and I think there's no better way to do this than actually being able to travel between them. We have the technology now, so let's make it happen. So Fox would begin on Corneria as you learn the basics of your toolset. The gameplay when on foot would be a bit more similar to a third-person shooter with tight but easy-to-master mechanics, so guns with Z-targeting abilities, reflector shields, some hand-to-hand combat, all pulling some similarities from his gameplay in Smash. And then throughout the game you gain new abilities and power-ups such as the Fox Illusion and Fire Fox, which would enable differing combat and varied enemies, but also allow access to new areas in a Metroid or Zelda-style approach. I wouldn't want a huge emphasis on puzzles like Zelda has, but ideally, to keep it interesting, the whole star system would be sort of a puzzle itself, more akin to a Metroid. Starlink suffered some because, although the flying was great, anytime you were on a planet, you remained in your ship, having to bob and weave in a way that felt unnatural on land. The reason this was the mechanic for Starlink was purely because it was a Toys to Life game focused on ship upgrades. So although on-foot sections would have maybe felt more natural, they had to stay true to their product, which was the Toys to Life ships. But since Star Fox Galaxy wouldn't do that, as you descend on a planet, you'll be first greeted with whatever the primary area or hub is, and depending on the upgrades or abilities you've acquired so far, you may not even be able to descend. Finchina, for example, would be accessible at its surface, but perhaps would have areas frozen over that you'd need a plasma ray to break through and reach the essential areas. That said, it would be cool still if a planet such as this would have small areas you can access from any point in the game, but for limited amounts of time, so the region you can't enter doesn't feel artificial. Think like the cold areas in Breath of the Wild. You can get to them, but you take damage over time until you have the means to withstand it. But once you get down to a planet, there would be several hubs that house the majority of the on-foot content, but to travel between them may feel tedious or empty without a solid reason. So until you get to another area in which you can perhaps develop a fast travel or hyperspeed travel point, you'd need incentive to travel around in your ship, more like in Starlink. This is where I think the on-rails sections would slot in perfectly. Even if they're not exactly on rails, you could be chasing down enemy ships that are making their way to destroy the hub you're making your way towards. If you don't catch them in time, then that area would obviously be unexplorable, at which point you'd probably just have to restart the chase. And this brings me to something that I think is really fun. It would be really cool if there was a couple of chases like this that create a bit of a fork in the road with an either-or scenario. We know that the original Star Fox formula was arcadey and meant for replayability, so although that's not the purpose of this title, an element of that should return. So if you're in a hub on Fortuna and find that there are 2 different enemy squadrons heading in opposite directions, you may have to choose which to follow, and whichever location you don't save will close off a portion of that game. This would be pulling concepts from all sorts of narrative-based games these days like The Witcher, Divinity Original Sin, concept for Mass Effect, and all that. It would mean that your decisions have weight. So Star Fox Galaxy would be an open star system game with on-foot dungeons and areas to explore, open-ended, semi-linear progression with lots of secrets, power-ups, and some divergent paths to make the world feel real and reactive. This may sound like a lot of work, and to be honest, it could be, but it's nevertheless something that I could see happening. I don't see a Starlink 2 coming out unless it abandons its Toys to Life foundation, and even though the game was designed quite spectacularly, the story and characters were quite rote and uninspired, especially compared to some of the Star Fox cast. So that team has this expertise sitting around, and especially since Fox's inclusion in Starlink was per Nintendo's request, and it sold so much better on the Switch, I could see Nintendo partnering with Ubisoft to co-develop this game with the global foundation of StarLink, but obviously using the game design principles Nintendo is generally revered for. Of course, the other recent concept was Star Fox Grand Prix, and to be fair, I think there's a way this could have worked, although it seems like it was never really real. I do like this idea a good bit, and I've mentioned before that I think a Galaxy Racers idea would be cool, as a Mario Kart style crossover, but with Star Fox, F-Zero, Sin and Punishment, Pikmin, and so on. But if we're to assume that all of the Star Fox games really did result in the Lylat system being saved, then Fox McCloud going into the racing circuit would be a neat premise. What I'd prefer, though, is to roll that into Star Fox Galaxy. That could be one of his tutorial missions on Corneria, showing him how to fly by racing, and then could be the foundation of several other missions on other planets, Fox racing to achieve access to a new area, or NPC, or something like that. This could even be the core of the game's multiplayer, especially if it still retains some of what's most quintessential of the Star Fox moves, laser guns, barrel rolls, and whatnot. But that's what I think. What do you think? Do you anticipate Star Fox to come back at all? And if so, would you prefer it to fix up the old systems or create and collate new ones? Let me know all that and more in the comment section below, and we'll pull some of those comments to bring to the podcast this weekend directly to you, youtube.com/directly to you, Saturday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. And while you're down there, be sure to like the video and subscribe to fanatixfour for more content like this every Tuesday and Thursday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. All right, that's it for me. See you guys next week.